Hello, welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we're going to be looking at Volume 12, Issue 6, An Empire Under Pressure, Germanic Raiding and Invasion. Beyond our patrons who are watching live, hi guys, with me to discuss the topic is regulars Jasper Oorthuys, Lindsay Powell, Murray Dahm, Myke and Marc DeSantis. So, to kick off, the introduction to the theme of the magazine suggests that the Germanic tribes along the frontier had been largely quiet. Now, I can loop this question in with one from one of our patrons, Cosma, to kick us off. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest and the successful revenge campaign of Germanicus that resulted in the death of Arminius, did the empire enjoy a period without major Germanic raids?
On the Rhine, yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, you could even during the Batavian Revolt, the Batavians actively tried to involve Germanic tribes from across the Rhine into their revolt, and it doesn't seem to really have worked. So as far as we know, it's always a good thing to interject, of course, it was fairly quiet.
So why was there a change it's the early 3rd century?
Yeah, it starts in the early 3rd century. Well, it's difficult to say why the Germans suddenly decided to start raiding the empire. Because they didn't leave any sources, or hardly any. It seems to be a combination of opportunism. If the Roman Empire is perceived as being weak, that means that it might be attractive to go and find something there, because of course they've, the 3rd century, you get the period of the soldier emperors and more or less constant civil war. So the armies along the Rhine are thinned out to make into campaign armies, and they go off into other areas of the empire. So it gets easier to raid across the Rhine, and there's less of a threat of a very, a violent counter-reaction from the Roman army. Although it does happen, and the Romans show several times that they don't forget either. So there's opportunism. It's possible that there's some kind of economic or like food pressure. I think there's we don't talk about it in the issue, but I think there's a climate change that sets in the 3rd century. It's possible that that's why they went and tried to get supplies and stuff from across the Rhine, and there seems to have been actual pressure from further east. It's the Huns that end up dominating Central Europe in the 5th century that start to push westward, and they push other tribes westward, which push other tribes westward, and it's a sort of a domino effect until you get to the Rhine and have to go somewhere.
I don't have an answer, but I have a question that I would like to add on, if it's okay. In these 300 years, one of the things that I think we'd all agree is occurring is you're having intercourse between German communities along the Rhine, both sides of the river, and Roman garrisons, right? You're having
absolutely
you're having Germanization, right? There's that famous letter of the Roman Holmes complaining that his son is wearing trousers like a German and won't wear the toga virilis. I'm not sure exactly what that letter dates to. Is that intercourse, is that Germanization and the demysticization? So there's a lot more understanding of Rome's relative position by the Germans, and there's a lot more intimacy between Roman garrison communities and German communities along the Rhine. Does this play a role in familiarity breeding contempt, or in a sense of Germans feeling they have a right to their place inside Roman territory that influences the restarting of raids 300 years later?
I don't know a right, but I think it certainly is. It breeds a familiarity, whether that's contempt or not, or just knowledge of what's going on inside the empire, and therefore it burgeons opportunism, as in, well, we know where the garrisons are. I mean, we've got little bits and pieces of evidence, like Nero sending a freedman to the Baltic coast to gather all this amber, and you're like, that's a long journey for a Roman trader to make. And he goes with, as far as we know, very little bodyguard. So there's like this deep penetrating merchant mission in the 60s AD. That means there's contacts, there's relationships. We've got the development of the runic Futhark around that time in the 1st century AD as well. So it's a two-way street of Romanization and Germanification. All the words. And so I think it's absolutely, there are people in the Roman side of the in the Roman side of the Rhine and on the German side of the Rhine that know quite intimately what's going on inside the Roman Empire through trade and networks and all of that sort of stuff, which means that when the denuding of the empire frontier happens, they know about it, and that information spread, I would imagine.
It's probably in this whole discussion important to remember that we tend to think of the limes, the border of the empire, as a hard border. It's sometimes we think of Hadrian's Wall, which if you think in modern times, it might even be like the Iron Curtain. It's like, bang, here's the border. This is the empire. That's not Game of Thrones, like it's 100 meters high wall. It's much more of a really big zone, and the Roman Empire certainly does not stop thinking of the areas across the Rhine as outside the empire or not under Rome. It doesn't give up like a claim to those lands. These people are all like, there's endless debate. Is this border, is the limes meant? Is this just sort of a control difference? It's just a way to funnel traders, for instance, through certain points so that you can tax them properly and you can keep sort of control of what's going in and out? Or is this really like we're keeping the barbarians out?
There was also the development of tribal confederations. Larger, smaller tribes were being grouped into the Franks or the Alemanni, and these larger tribal confederations were more formidable opponents for the Romans. Going to the period of a question of was Rome more vulnerable, and how much would the Germanic peoples across the Rhine have known about it? The Roman Empire suffered terribly from plagues. For example, the plague of 251 cost many, many lives among the ordinary people of the Roman Empire, and it can't be. It had to have been known how badly Rome had suffered by people outside of the empire, and that there must have been depopulated districts. There must have been, or simply that possibly the frontier garrisons had been weakened, and that probably would have attracted raiding groups who saw the opportunity to attack a weakened Rome.
Well, even when vast populations of entire nations of Germanic tribes are invited to settle in areas of the Balkans and places, there must have been huge tracts of depopulated land. How do you invite several 100,000 barbarians in and say, right, this is your area, you settle here? That sort of implies that there was huge tracts of land available to them, and not, there wasn't the forced removal of locations, or the these are not the wilds of some of the other sort of similar ways of treating populations. So it's quite amazing. But I think also knowledge of that would have been widespread on the barbarian side.
The thing I keep recalling is on bases in Iraq, we would have almost no Muslim Iraqis working for us as coalition forces. Iraqi Maronite and Phalangite sort of Syriac Christians that would work on post. And I'll never forget, one of the hardest things about it was, you work with these people day in and day out, and you form friendships with them. And then you would get other people on post who would be like, what are you doing? You're telling this guy where you live. He's going to count off the number of paces to your hooch, and he'll be able to call in mortar fire or rocket fire on you, or tell a sniper who you are, outside the wire. That kind of dichotomy and our sort of this desire on the part of us to form relationships and be friends with the people we were with, and this constant fear that you never knew who was an intelligence agent for the enemy, maybe even not for ideological purposes, but simply because this is how they fed their families. And I keep thinking that there had to be a similar dynamic to some extent on the Rhine border, where you have Romans taking German wives or, forming friends with local populations. And then this kind of tension between, well, is this person really, loyal to the empire or friends of the empire, or are they going to, use this for their own advantage? I wonder if that same tension existed.
Well, that's an interesting point. We've got a question not on a similar lines from one of our patrons, Andrew, who asks if Germanic peoples who were sort of settled in on the Roman centres and participating in sort of Roman ways of life, but close to the borders, did they take part? What happened to them in the large scale raids? Or did they stay separate, or did they join the Germanic raiders? Do we have any idea?
Yeah, we do. There's an article in the issue that describes how one German who lived around Trier, so just on the western side of the Rhine, he took it upon himself as a sort of vigilante to raid the camps of the raiders. And he would just go in there at night and cut some throats and come back in the morning and say, look what I got. Similarly, the famous crossing of the Rhine in 406, the Franks who lived on the border actually attacked the coalition. So there's definitely evidence that that this is not a homogeneous mass of all barbarians coming at Rome. It's there's degrees, and you could argue that in some cases these Germanic peoples had Romanized to a great degree, and perhaps knew a good thing when they saw it, or they felt like, hey, we're here now, and we don't want you. Don't come and mess it up.
And I think coming back to Mike's point, I think we know several of the Roman leaders, Arminius obviously being the most famous, but even in later periods where individual barbarian leaders have knowledge of Roman institutions, Roman tactics, Roman, they are Roman officers, and they then betray their Roman colleagues in order to return to their tribal colleagues. So we know that in, Fritigern, for instance, and things like that, where they've been invited in, they've been given these privileges. So I think when the trials happen, we learn about them.
Do we have evidence of German raiders punishing Romanized Germans as collaborators? Because that was one thing we saw all the time in Iraq.
I don't think so. And that possibly also, that presupposes sort of an understanding of maybe a nationhood or cultural unity that I'm not sure we can apply here.
Well, I was going to ask about, we were using the phrase Germanic. Is there a certain ethnicity we can apply to these people, tribes, or are we just being very fast and loose with the term?
I think that it's probably Romans being fast and loose.
It's funny because they're all barbarians, and then when one crosses and establishes itself, we suddenly the differentiation handles the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Goths, the Alemanni, and yet within those you start to get for instance, when the Goths invade before Adrianople, you get they're Goths, but there are also Heruls, there are Alans, there are lots of subsections, but they are still all under the same kind of blanket term. And yet at the same time, you get the Visigoths, you get the Franks, who obviously establish Francia and France after that. Because of the weakness of the Roman Empire at the time.
And the Alemanni give Germany their name.
They kind of take on. Absolutely, there are tribes which do things which give names down to our modern day, and yet at the same time they're all barbarians because they're not Roman or not recognised as Roman. Even though we're arguing now that they're much more Roman than the Romans would have allowed. So,
I think from an academic point of view nowadays, it's probably very difficult to separate any tribes. I assume that some, if there is any evidence of writing, then it'll be all, everything we know about their languages is going to be, it fits in the Germanic language group. And archaeologically, I think I doubt it'll have changed very much. I doubt it'll have changed very much since, like, the difference between Celts and Germans sort of along the Rhine is very difficult to make archaeologically. You can hardly separate them. I suppose the same goes for groups later on.
I certainly know that was the case at the time of Caesar. Reading De Bello Gallico, I know that you're basically talking almost about one ethno-linguistic group, or it's so impossible to untangle. I did not realize that was the case so much later.
Well, it's funny. I think the Romans could appeal to specific. So the Cimbri and the Teutones, who are rampaging in the 120s BC until they're defeated by Marius in 102 and 101. That memory is brought up time and time again, even when the tribes involved aren't related to the Cimbri Teutones, who are essentially wiped out. That sort of fear of the German barbarian is brought up again and again and again, even though they're not specifically the same tribe.
The Romans get traumatized an awful lot. First it's the Celts, and then they carry that with them for a couple centuries, and then there's the Germans, and they basically never get over it.
Well, I wonder if, as all our sources are kind of one-sided, if they needed for them to be like something, those sources. So it's a very distorted view that we get because there's some sort of internal propaganda going on within our sources.
No, I think that is an excellent point. There's for me, of course, everything goes back to Sparta. There's a Swiss historian, François Ollier, writing in the 1930s, comes up with this notion, le mirage spartiate, the Spartan mirage. This idea that because we literally have no sources from the Spartans, except for tiny poetry fragments of dubious provenance, really everything we understand about them comes to us mostly from Athenian eyes. You're telling me we have an almost identical situation here for reckoning Germans, is that everything comes externally from them. Is that correct?
There are sources that are filtered. You've got Jordanes and later writers who clearly have gained some understanding of the various tribes, and they actually differentiate. He was from this tribe, and he was from that tribe, and he was from this tribe. But it's almost how much does that filter distort? Not that it would have mattered to the Roman.
Well, you could argue that the Romans, there's very few Spartans who join Athens and become part of that society, and that by the time the 6th century Roman authors look back, there are going to have they might even have Germanic ancestors in some way. They would probably not admit it, but there's a more of a mixing going on there. There's much more integrated society.
So this is not. We're not dealing with a German mirage. This is something very different.
Yeah.
It probably also depends on the period.
I think by the time that the barbarians are integrated within Roman society, they want to stress their Romanitas rather than their Germanitas, I suppose. So the kind of, the sacking of Rome in 410 by Alaric and, all of that sort of stuff is, and even when you're reading the poetry of Claudian and things, the Romanness is emphasized because we want you to be Roman, because we've accepted you, rather than your barbarian aspects are kind of glossed over, and then they behave like a barbarian and sack Rome, as you do, and it's sort of like, they kind of ignore that, but it's an internal propaganda, I think, absolutely. But even earlier, you have internal propaganda in the sense of reassuring Romans. So after that denuding of all of the armies in the 3rd century, when they do the same thing in the early 4th century, and they denude the frontier armies to fight civil wars, there's a whole series of coin issues which seem to be, a fabulously immediate way of giving propaganda to your population, that the borders of the empire are still being looked after, despite the fact that we've actually taken all the men from them to fight each other.
There's a couple of guys in that fort there.
Yeah, we're still looking after, how many guys do you need in a watchtower? I mean, they're a kilometre apart. They're all along the Rhine frontier. One guy, it's like 1,000 guys. It's like less than a legion. It's fine. We're looking after the border. And that's also, if it's a permeable border anyway, then a watchtower, well, they can let us know that they've through, and we're on it. But, that's always an interesting one. So I think you're right. There is internal propaganda.
It's defense in depth, It's a conscious choice.
Absolutely.
So to move us on again, Chris,
I had a lovely boxing analogy.
Go on then, crack on.
I was going to say that it's basically the Roman roper-doper tactic, that they let the bubs in, they take a few blows to the face, and then they exhaust themselves, and by the 12th round, the Romans, Muhammad Ali, come back and wipe them, and that works. Adrian! Sometimes, and then and then other times they get smashed and they lose big chunks of the empire for large periods of time.
Chris, one of our patrons asked, was fundamentally, was these raids fundamentally different, from the ones in the 390s BC? Are barbarians?
Well, without real statistics to show how big they were, what was going on, it's hard to say. It does seem to me that the raids by Germanic peoples over the Rhine frontier, and probably even the Danube, it probably was a lot of different things, but it strikes me as being a lot like the Viking raids of later centuries, where these were not necessarily whole tribal level, national level, I'm putting that in air quotes, attacks. That is, these were groupings of young warriors collecting around a particularly noteworthy, fierce leader who could lead them well and get them loot. And I think that probably we should also make a distinction between the kind of raids that various Germanic peoples went on during, say, the 3rd century and the 4th century, and then what we see in the early 5th century, where you have relatively large groups of people crossing the Rhine and then going to, for example, the Visigoths going to southern France, and the Vandals are in Spain, and then they cross to Africa. That is, I still don't think that these were necessarily, for example, all of the Vandal people went to Spain and then North Africa, but it does seem to me that you probably... They differed in not just in degree, but in kind, where you had extremely large groups that were able to establish themselves for long periods of time over wide areas, which itself was also, I think, a testament to the weakness of the Western Roman government at the time. That is, that they could not.
But they're looking to stay. Groups. That's the difference later on. They are looking to stay. I mean, we have some inscriptions from the 3rd century where a Roman army intercepts a raid that's, it's got full of lots of booty, and they're trying to get back across the Rhine, and they're intercepted. That's clearly a different thing.
I don't know if this is germane or not, but what's interesting is, for example, if you then transpose that back to the first, second, get my teeth in order. 1st century BC. There you go. That's what I was trying to say. Finally came out. Is the issue there really, I think, of just the raids for purposes of gathering booty and loot. For example, Lollius crashing into a bunch of Germans by accident and losing his eagle in 17 BC was purely down to economic incentives rather than any kind of territorial gain. What was interesting is how it then provoked the Roman response to stop this, because it was one of many going back over several decades that actually led to the Romans counteracting to be able to prevent any more of these economic raids. So in fact, it provoked the Roman response to conquer as a preventative measure.
I just want to say the caveat, which I'm sure we all agree with. Are barbarians barbarians? Of course not. We are talking about very loose ethno-linguistic groupings for huge swaths of people over several centuries. This is like saying, are all Native Americans alike? You have desert-dwelling Hopi sedentary people. You have plains-dwelling Lakotas. It's the same thing here. These are, I just want to make sure that we say to the listeners, of course, that we are dealing with extremely varied people, and the term barbarian is an outward-looking term that Romans and Hellenized people are using to group them together.
On the other hand, I do wonder that there's a kind of a pecking order. So, for example, one barbarian, as the Romans or Greeks might call them, is more terrifying than another one. And to go back to my 1st century BC analogy, I mean, the Suebi were everybody's enemy, and the people southwest of those people constantly migrated away from them. And in fact, some of the raids over the Rhine were caused because they were terrified by the awful people behind them. And in fact, on the other side by the Danube, there was, I think, Florus describes the Sarmati as being so awful. There's basically no word in the Latin language that can encapsulate the horror of it. So I just wanted to say there's a kind of pecking order.
The pecking order changes because you get they're bad, yeah, but they're nothing like the Sarmats. Mind you, I think I think Mike's right. The barbarian is a internal Roman and Greek way of looking at the other. So they are used this one term of the barbarian, meaning the barbaroi, meaning they don't speak our language, they're not like us. So I think in many terms the differentiation between the differences between tribes in terms of cultural practice, in terms of decoration, in terms of all of those styles of warfare are. We've recovered them in a way that the Romans wouldn't have been interested in noting, other than they're different. They all chop heads off. They all hang them from their saddles. Well, they don't, but that's kind of this way that they're looked upon because they're barbarian. And we see these things in archaeology and through various subtle. I love it when the people look at the language and what we would write as a typo, which is obviously much more difficult to do when you're handwriting. And people go, well, no, that's actually a survival of their language group in a wider language group, because the people from this tribe only make that spelling mistake. Therefore, it's a sign of their language. You're like, oh my God, that's cool. But
I wonder though. I wonder whether we overplay the barbarian word usage. So when I've been researching all these books that I've done, and a lot of the work has taken me to look across the Rhine to Germania, specifically, I don't find a lot of use of barbari, or whatever the Latin equivalent of barbarian is, in any of the Roman sources. What they tend to refer to is the name of the tribe, or as I prefer to call them, the natio, the nation. Because the Romans like to label things quite precisely. It's part of them showing off that we kind of control these things. We have a name for them. And in fact, Germani is a concocted name which the people of that area didn't call themselves. From what I understand, it was Julius Caesar coined the phrase for some etymological reason. It sort of, on the one hand, means same or other. On the other hand, it's sort of like a collective. But again, it's the Roman mentality imposing order on a chaos across the way there. We've given them a name, we can therefore order it, and so on. But I haven't seen much use in Tacitus or Suetonius or any of the sources I've used for this expression barbarian. I think it's more a modern usage.
I know it's certainly in Ammianus and the later sources to talk about the barbarians. But even the
Marcellinus is practically medieval, isn't he? He's what year is he? Does he write?
He's mid 4th century.
372. he records the Battle of Adrianople, and then we're not sure what happens to him after that. So he's certainly fourth
Myke is right. It's medieval.
Yeah. It's post second century AD, therefore it's outside my.
Yes, it's medieval. Possibly medieval.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm interested in ancient history.
I had a point to make. Before, and I can't remember what it was, but it was something to do with what Myke was talking about. And I can't remember it. Which I think is, but that idea of labeling is interesting, of course, because the Romans labeling is not the men themselves labeling. Oh, that's what it was. It was about plunder raids. So you get that idea later in Ammianus and others that this is different because their women and children are coming with them. They are populations relocating, whether because of population pressure further east or for whatever reasons. It's a population shift, not a raid by warriors only. The other thing that you've got in several instances is kingship disputes within tribes, even to the point where tribes split because of a kingship dispute, and a king candidate proving themselves goes on a raid to gain reputation, to gain wealth, even in some cases to gain a set of allies by joining the Roman army and becoming part of the Roman auxilia. Therefore, they are gaining reputation, gaining followers, gaining wealth that then they can take back across the Rhine, Danube, and become more kingly and more of a acceptable candidate, if you like.
So again, if you go back to Tacitus and his description of the Germans, I mean, he talks about those things. You've just said that the need for a man to make himself the sort of the war chief, but he goes on these raids to show his masculinity, his power, and so on. And some of them change with every campaign season in certain nations. In others, they become almost like a Latin or a Greek king, and they live for a generation until they die. So it very much is specific to the community and the people that you're talking about, isn't it?
The Alia in 390. I know that's way back, but I've always viewed that as a kind of root trauma in the Roman psyche, like the sacking of Rome by these barbarians, I guess.
But they always called them the Gauls. Yeah.
All right. So the sacking of Rome by the Gauls is this defining moment in the Roman psyche. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how that impacted sort of how the Romans viewed well, you said they don't call them the Germans, but how they viewed the Suevi, or how the description of these horrible terrors, of this sort of institutional fear. How much of that is sort of a cultural throwback to that root experience, or has that completely faded from Roman cultural memory at the time we're describing?
Oh, I don't think it's faded. I would imagine it's part of their sort of war mythology. They lay a cake of reasons for going on their outward conquest. But at that time, I mean, Romans are really in Italy, and they're building their alliances with other tribes. And I think what that probably promotes is emboldening of treaties, so that you can call upon allies when you're in need of help, and they come to your aid. And I think that's one of the characteristics of the Roman approach to politics, diplomacy, and war, which is different than other people, that you don't have to be conquering people in the first stages. You can actually work with partners and allies and so on. And then it sort of becomes then the problem with those allies thinking, hold on, we're providing a lot of the cannon fodder here. We don't seem to be getting a fair share of the gains. And they have a social war, and then eventually under Marius it's kind of soft. But I think Romans remember in the sort of collective memory these losses. They remember Arausio. They remember the First, Second, and Third Punic Wars. And of course, it's part of their, we've talked about this in other podcasts, of their strength is their ability to come back in the face of those terrible defeats. And in the case of the Gauls, I mean, there's the Capitoline geese or something, isn't it? They sort of bleat and they saved the city and all sorts of great things. So they clearly have the backing of their gods. That there's a divine driving force here as well as part of their mythology.
As opposed to the dogs who didn't bark.
Well, the Gauls had cut their tongues out.
So there was a religious procession. There was a religious procession every year where they crucify a dog and lead a goose around on a cushion to basically show that the dogs had betrayed them and that the geese had not. And that's part of the cultural memory that you're talking about too, Myke. That every year, 1,000 years later, they're still having this ceremony to say this is what happened. But even Claudian in the 4th century is recalling Marius and the Germanic invasions because it's a similar parallel. And I think that as the empire goes on and becomes even more removed from its republican past, they refer back to republican events to say, see, we are the same. We're having the same issues that that they had. We are Roman. We are Rome.
Well, their mythologies, of course, is they are the res publica right to the end, aren't they? It's always the Roman.
Well, right till 1453, according to the fall of Byzantium, because they still call themselves the Romanoi, whereas we're the ones who split them out.
In Greek, yeah.
Yes, shush with your nitpicking Greek Latin. We're all Roman, unless you're barbarian, until we assimilate you, and then you are. You're Roman. Or
Barbarian, Barbatus.
Well, the wonderful thing is the way in which, for example, the conquered or annexed or Romanized provinces, of course, as part of their very process of being pacified and being Romanized, will adopt exactly those same calendar of festivals and events and blend them in even with their own. So it becomes part of a sort of collective history.
You then get the Roman emperors who are, in fact, the Ostrogothic emperors, and which kind of then melds, and we're definitely into the medieval period by that point. But that blurring of the lines is part of the problem. And I think as you said, the Romans' ability to recover has all been what marks them out, and then to be old-fashioned until Adrianople, where they don't really recover again, and the West is lost. Giving seeds for fantasy writers forevermore. So
if we're looking at this ability to recover, to segue into another question, how do they prevent or how do they stop the raids? They seem to launch deep penetrations onto the other side of the Rhine. Is that right? I'm seeing some of these ridiculously deep.
It's date and time specific. So my period's 1st century BC AD, and I would say that, for example, so Julius Caesar famously crosses the Rhine twice and goes some depth in, and he's really doing it partly for propaganda reasons, but there's also the allies, the Ubii, who are saying, we have these Suebi behind us and we're terrified, will you please help us? And they kind of go and deal with that. And ultimately, I think I said to Marcus Agrippa, the Ubii will be brought across the other side of the Rhine, where they will be founded in a city called Oppidum Ubiorum, which we know better now as Cologne. So there you actually have a Roman interventionist policy, which is actually, first of all, to come to the aid and keep them away, and then actually to integrate them into Roman society, and they provide men for units and so on much later. It really, and I go back to this Lollius interaction, because it became known as the Clades Lolliana, which is the Lollian disaster, and that was several years before Varus's, in roughly the same kind of geography, that the Romans actually make a point to finally go into the Rhineland area and beyond. And what seems to have happened is that they would first of all pick on the people who were responsible for the raid. So it would be the Sugambri, the Usipetes, then Tenteri, for example. And then when they had dealt with those, they would either just camp out the season or they cross the Rhine again, for example, under Nero Drusus. And then they come back the following year. And then really under Nero Drusus, you get an attempt to drive a logical west-eastward campaign, which is expressly for conquest and annexation and the interaction with allies, and they get to work with the Canonifates and the Batavi and the other people and so on. And it really goes all the way through to Tiberius to try and to bring some order to all of that, but it all goes horribly wrong, and I'm sure you've covered it already with Arminius. But it really is only until 15, 13, 14, 12 BC that you get a positive policy to go there. The impression I have from the sources, the Romans really had no particular desire, no particular want or need even to cross the Rhine. They had people trading. There's a story in one of the sources, I think it's Florus, where people going across, centurions were captured and crucified and terribly badly treated. Of course, this causes the requisite outrage. So there's a casus belli if you need one. But they don't always respond. They can be provoked, but they say the calculus doesn't work out for us. And finally, with Lollius, I think Augustus is teased off and says, enough already. We actually are going to deal with this now.
I think the fact is that, again, we have the problem from Tacitus to Ammianus. We don't have a source really that deals with it in any decent depth. We have Cassius Dio. But the fact is that I think the deep penetrating raids to us Romanitas in the depths of the barbarian nations does continue. It's very hard to establish from the source material. So, for instance, in Domitian's Germanic War, we have virtually nothing surviving. There's 4 stratagems of Frontinus that cover it, and a couple of other things. But that's the same thing, is that they march 120 miles over the Rhine, punish, establish a Roman camp, and then leave. But the whole idea of establishing a Roman camp deep within enemy territory is, we were here, we can come back. The fact that you have a Roman camp in your territory shows you that we're the powerful ones. And then you get the same with Trajan's penetration to the Dacian capital. Those sorts of raids. The article in the magazine about Thrax, the Roman Empire, and the new discovery only in 2008 of the new battle, which is deep in territory. So I think that those things continue, but you're of centuries where the source material for us is so confused, and when you look at the Scriptores Historiae Augustae, that it just it's like who can tell what's going on, with what's true, what's not. It's the real invention of alternate facts and fake news, because there's whole biographies in there that you're not sure. And I see, 2 days ago, a coin of Electus was found in Kent, which is only the 24th Electus coin ever found, which again is that taking advantage.
A gold one.
Yes, indeed. That take advantage of the weakness of the empire. In the 3rd century, you have the foundation of a British empire. When they break away from the Roman Empire, the Gallic Empire, the British Empire, lots of breakaway units, even Palmyra, break away when Rome shows itself being weak. So even internally, Rome breaks apart, let alone allowing barbarians to cross the Rhine. So I think it's 2 things. One is the deep penetrating raids. The second is having groups of barbarians on the border areas to be like an absorption rope-a-dope sponge to take the hit whilst Rome recovers, real Rome. But the problem is, of course, that as those tribes on the border have been there for long, they are Roman, and therefore they're not expendable in the way that they were when they were brought across. So that's one of the issues.
So I was going to throw into the mix there, for example, I'm looking at a map here in one of the books I did about Germany, as it turns out, is the role of allies and client kings. So, for example, under Augustus, there was a temptation, I think, that, yes, there were lands that you had direct control over, but there was the indirect control over an area that might be considered a generation before as barbarian, but because of a client-king relationship, like a Herod, like a Deiotarus or someone, that to all intents and purposes is Roman. And then there are treaty allies that you have across the Rhine, for example, the Cananephates, the Chauci, the Angrivari, the Marcomanni, and finally the Hermunduri. What wonderful names. And Augustus can look at those people, as long as the kings or the warlords have actually come to them, people like Milo or the Sugambri, for example, and shown the proper sort of deference, homage, and just respect that he as a commander-in-chief deserves, he sort of can pass off those areas as Roman. And it's an odd sort of idea. It's a sort of there's a real empire and there's a virtual one beyond it, which is kind of under Roman control. So again, they're not thought of as barbarians. They're thought of as loyal allies. And for example, amongst the Cherusci, for example, Inguiomarus, as I remember, who I think is the uncle of Arminius, is a very respected commander in his own right, certainly under the period of Germanicus. And they're very disappointed that he sides with his nephew because they thought he'd always been a good sort. And
they're allies until they rebel, and then they're horrible, horrible barbarians who will destroy. So, you know.
But Romans will rehabilitate. This is the interesting thing. So, for example, people like Marbodus, interestingly, for example, had, in the sort of period between the first German wars and the Teutoburg disaster, had assumedly left Rome and had gone off to become the king or the leader of his Marcomanni, and had moved his people sort of eastwards. And Tiberius was charged with, eliminate them, knock them out of the game, take their part of it, and basically encapsulate that whole area across the Rhine. And what's very interesting is that halfway through the campaign, there's the Balkan Revolt, and then Tiberius has to pull back and make a sort of nominal treaty with Marc. But transfer later into time where you have the Teutoburg disaster, Arminius sends the head of Varus to Marc and says, look, see, I got the head, join us. And he doesn't. He honors the treaty with Augustus. He sends the head back. And Varus's head is buried in the mausoleum of his family, the Quinctilii. So what I'm saying is that you can actually have a barbarian who, by going back and said, I made a mistake, I fess up, I stand by the treaty, the Romans will rehabilitate you.
To a point, and I think by the 4th century that's not happening. And I think it's also coming back to your point, Lindsay, about the fact that the Romans make a treaty with you, you're their ally, you're Romanized. The barbarians on the other side make a treaty with Rome, or they ask for Roman help. They do not consider that they are allied with Rome, and they can renege that treaty because they didn't make a treaty. They asked for help and they got help. But that's, expediency rather than binding for all time. What you get in the Roman sources is the idea that these Gothic and Ostrogothic tribes and Visigothic tribes betray the treaty. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's not their perspective. Perspective isn't that they had a treaty. They made a one-off deal to make, life easier for them in the one-off occasion when they needed it. And now they're invading Roman territory because it's expedient for them to do so. And they might make off a one-off deal in the future too. Whereas the Roman perspective is, no, you betrayed the treaty. And so, of course, because of our written sources, we get the Roman perspective rather than the non-Roman perspective. And yet the non-Roman perspective of, no, now we're going to invade, now we're going to take this chunk of land and then we're going to keep moving, is this kind of betrayal
and to take that
rather than expedient.
And to take that example one step further, for example, I think what you're hinting at in the sense is a cultural either misunderstanding of what they're actually doing. So in the Mediterranean world, with the very sophisticated commerce and a diplomatic network and all those going back in a millennia almost, where there's customs that you follow and you give gifts. So there is a way that in legal terms a treaty is honoured in cultures across the Mediterranean. The further away from that you go, maybe there isn't quite the same sort of mental infrastructure.
I don't know. I mean, if you look at
when you get to, for example, what I was going to say, but let me say. So, for example, when you get to Britain under Prasutagus, for example, he seems to think that he has a treaty with, I would imagine would it be Vespasian, whoever it is, and then when he dies, and in the meantime, the Romans come to collect the loan money that they've given them. It seems to be that Boudica didn't seem to read the treaty that way, and then therefore there's a rebellion because the Romans imposed their punishment on her daughters. So I'm just wondering whether that was a willful misreading by Boudica or whether that was genuine, you didn't get it, perhaps.
I think the Romans' way of dealing with treaties is very, very different to the rest of the Mediterranean. Like, if you look at Greek treaties, they aren't limited for all time. They are very, very limited. Sometimes they're a summer. We're at peace now. Tomorrow, till next year after the harvest, and then we'll decide again whether we fight. You do get these remarkable treaties of we're going to have 50 years peace. Wow, that's a long time. It only lasts less than 10. But I think the Romans imposing of their will on foreign people is very different from the rest of the Mediterranean's idea of what a treaty comes to. So I don't know that other people not understanding a cultural. I think it's Rome's. Like, you look at the influence, in the Carthaginians, they're imposing limits on others that if they breach, they've broken our treaty. But if we breach, we haven't broken our version of the treaty. Whereas if you look at other treaties, so I think the barbarian interpretation of the treaty absolutely is a cultural thing, but I don't think they're breaching any kind of millennia-long mores. I think it's very much the Romans interpreting as a breach. Whereas if the Romans breach it, it's not a breach at all.
There's a fascinating book, and I've struggled to find it, and I can let you know afterwards. But and I used it because it's a scholar has brought together all of the fragments of treaties that are extant, and I mean, they do any modern lawyer proud. I mean, they just paragraph after paragraph of obligations, and to your point, Murray, about sort of involving the responsibility of third parties. So, A, B, and C. So, for example, A and B have the treaty, but if B goes to war against C, well, they actually, they either have to call on the one, or they have to basically stand aside while the one goes and deals with it. So you're right. There is a controlling of influence in this, but to go back to the point, I think that's why they are successful, because they're very good at being able to play this diplomatic game of chess, right, by controlling the pieces. And
absolutely, but I think therefore when the barbarians breach these treaties, they aren't breaching a treaty in their own sense. They're breaching a treaty in the Roman sense, and of course the Romans write the history. So we get the invasion idea, as opposed to, no, there's a vast tract of land over there that's empty because they've just had a plague. Let's move our entire population across the Rhine and move in because it's empty, and they've there's whole cities just waiting for us vacant. That's just expediency.
On the other hand, you'd think, well, as we just discussed before, that it's very likely that the Germans would know what the situation was with in Rome, in the Empire, but there surely must have been some kind of news, like the expedition that went into the Roman Empire a couple of years ago. They did that, and then the Romans came and burnt and killed everybody they could find. So, there's treaty understandings, and there's sort of experience that probably made it. How are these Romans going to respond? Well, the last time somebody went en masse across the Rhine, this is what happened.
We should maybe start. We've been talking. We should maybe start to think about winding things up. Now, I only have two questions left from people sent in, and they've bothered to send them in. So I feel I should ask them. Although I'm not completely sure we haven't actually answered one of these. Looking at these raids of the 3rd century, Brian. We finally got your question in, Brian. Are these Germanic raids conducted with the blessing of their leaders? Is there any hint of a more centrally organised sort of central organisation behind these raids than the Romans would admit?
What the military leadership structure looked like in the 3rd century AD among Germanic tribes? Do we have vision into that?
We normally have kings or chieftains mentioned, so or claimants to it, and they are again. One of the big issues that's pointed out is that Tacitus remains the go-to source for Germanic tribal structure right through until the Viking period. You'll find people talking about particular chapters of Tacitus's Germania right through until 1066, which is crazy, really, but it's the best source where you have a leader, they prove themselves, they gather to themselves loyal lieutenants who are therefore loyal to that leader and, won't leave the field of battle if their leader dies and all of that. So I think we've got vague ideas of structure, but nothing more than ways to make barbarian structure look like Roman structure so that the people reading the Roman sources can understand it. So the idea of heroic warriors with retinues makes sense to Roman readers, and they can understand it, but we don't get specific terminology for units or tactics. We kind of do. You get the I can't remember the term, but the wagon circle at Adrianople, Carrago, I think, is it Carrago? I think it's Carrago. That's used. So there are vague, every now and then, mentions of something that seems to be foreign, but it's sort of been assimilated by the Roman sources.
So finally, a question from Facebook. It said that the Huns forced the Germanic peoples to move west and south into the Roman Empire borders. But what was that which set off the rise in raids and invasions before the Huns?
Isn't that what we started this
Well, I was going to say
with?
it's sort of a circular question, isn't it? We haven't
it's
really
not my
given
period, really, but I'm going to suggest. I had heard somewhere, and you can trip me down in flames on this one, that there was some kind of either disease or climate change event, something like that, which was behind this.
Yeah, we've got. How about this issue of the Huns? The Huns. We haven't really mentioned about how much of an influence were they causing raids.
They're mentioned. We get mentions of that. They pushed us, they pushed them, and here we are crossing the Rhine. So you do get them kind of mentioned in the 4th century onwards, until obviously they burst on the scene in the 5th century and destroy all. Ancient astronaut theorists suggest, to be controversial, perhaps my favourite phrase, but I think it's so we don't know, and what is the spark that leads to, if it does begin with the Huns or the Hun ancestors deciding to move westward. We don't know what sparks that kind of movement that then puts pressure on everyone else, whether it's climate, whether it's crops, whether the Hunnic peoples were traditionally nomadic. So the idea that it's crop pressure, or it could be climate pressure, it could be the herds of their traditional
pasture pressure.
Yeah. So I think all of those things are they're not written anthropological and sort of very vague to try and pinpoint. And they're decades, if not centuries, of pressure, because that's, again, when you start to look at the patterns going back to some things, there have always been tribes pressuring to cross the Rhine. Then there's there's, like we said at the start, there's then what looks to be centuries of quiet, not necessarily, because our sources sort of disappear. And then we get a sort of a reburgeoning when Rome weakens in the 3rd century. So it's possible that those things have been happening throughout that period.
Well, not knowing is perhaps a fitting place to wrap this up. What do we think?
That's a fitting place to end every podcast, usually.
I don't want to put a hard border on it. I want it to be a kind of semi-permeable membrane, like the limes. Yeah.
Permeable.
Right, shall we leave it there? We're in between issues of the magazine for the next episode, so we'll be hunting for a topic. If you have a topic, send it in and I'll put it to the guys to see what they like the look of. You can find us on patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast, so shoot it over to us there, or you can use the Facebook page. So it's thank you to Jasper, Lindsay, Murray, Myke and Marc. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.